The metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to be the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross Friedman, founder and CEO of Super Social, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the metaverse.
In today's episode of Into the Metaverse, I'm so pumped to welcome Matthew Ball to the podcast. Matthew is a leading voice in the discussion on the evolution of the media landscape and the metaverse. He's preparing to release the second edition of his influential book, The Metaverse, and how it will revolutionize everything very soon, pretty much coming now. This is a release that our audience is not going to want to miss. Although Matthew's resume is quite extensive, some of the highlights that I'd like to call out, he's the CEO of Epilion, founder and CEO of Bold Metaverse Research Partners, a venture partner at Makers Fund, a senior advisor to KKR and McKinsey, a contributor to The Economist, and a best-selling author. Previously, Matthew was head of strategy and planning at Prime Video and Amazon Studios. He was the director of strategy investment at BD at Otter Media, which is part of the Churning Group, and he was the lead for executive and engagement at Accenture. Matthew, you obviously make everyone sound boring to hell, so congrats on the amazing journey you've been through. And we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation that is going to cover the metaverse past, or the short past, the present, the future. And I think you're going to enjoy Matthew's views on how AI advancements are really going to factor into the metaverse in his upcoming book and what we're going to talk today. So I'm 100% confident you're really going to enjoy this episode as much as I'm going to. Please rate, review, subscribe to our content so you don't miss any updates on Substack and beyond. And with that in mind, Matthew, welcome to the pause. Great to have you and see you on the show again.
Excited to be here.
So with all the excitement around the metaverse, and there isn't really anyone else in the world that, Matthew, has really been so synonymous with the metaverse as a theme over the past few years. Of course, this is not a new theme. This has been around for a long, long time, all the way from maybe the 50s and the 60s of the previous century. But you've truly became a thought leader and helping with your book and your other writings to make it more accessible as a theory, but also as a theme that people can really wrap their head around. And so with the upcoming book and all the writing that you've done, I want to take a different approach to how typically we start the podcast with every guest we have, which is typically our question is, what is the metaverse to you? And so today I want to start with something slightly different. I'd love you to first tell us what made you curious at the first place to write about the metaverse, and walk us through that genesis, that spark that made you want to think about this as a theme, and then we'll dive in deeper.
Sure, I love that as a starting point. My journey with the metaverse, like I think many in and around this field, doubtlessly yourself as well, starts in the early 90s when you first started going online, first started navigating 3D or just synthetic digital space. But then, like many of us at that same point, it ebbed and flowed in its relevance. I like to talk about this as being the third, if not fourth, bounce for this theme in the modern era. You had the first, which was in the early 90s. You have some of these digital communities start to emerge. Many in the community talk about MUDs, or multi-user dungeons, multi-user shared hallucinations, these unconstructed social spaces over the internet. If you can believe it, in 1993, usually when people say the World Wide Web had begun, a full 10% of all internet traffic was on MUDs and mushes, which tells you just how pioneering and fundamental this want is among those who are online. And then, of course, you get Second Life, actually debuts a few months before MySpace, if you can believe it. Then you get that, perhaps third bounce around the start of Magic Leap, many of the VR and XR headsets of the early 2010s. So I don't think that was really a third bounce. I think the third bounce, or fourth, if you give credit to those, started a few years ago. And that's where we hit my current interest and where most of my writing began. In 2018, I was spending a lot of time playing Fortnite Battle Royale. That was my first real commitment to Roblox. I probably spent 200 or 300 hours on the platform throughout 2018. And I started to get this sense that this 100-year-old idea, 70-year technical effort, 30-year term was actually starting to practically unfold around you. It was a very personal journey. And so at the end of 2018, I started writing this piece that was called Fortnite is the Future, but not for the reasons you think. And the thesis of that piece was very much that many of the seemingly innovative things about Fortnite, the fact that it was so revenue generative yet free to play, that it was cross-platform, not siloed, that it was monetizing through cosmetics that had no functional purpose, that it was mishmashing IP, that it pivoted from Save the World, a PvE experience, to a PvP battle royale, that all of those were compelling and they were remarkable, but they actually weren't new. They were new perhaps together. They were new in their degree of achievement and success, but they weren't actually new themselves, even though it was driving the press headlines. So my first real thrust in the metaverse was to make the argument that what we were seeing in Fortnite was very specifically constructing the metaverse, and that you could see it in the history of that company. You could see it in the history of Tim Sweeney. You could see it in the emergent behaviors, and then bubbling out a little bit further to say it's also not unique just to that platform. We're seeing it elsewhere. And so that work, which started in the tail end of 2018, led me to invest more in understanding the why now, what's coming together. Battle royales were only really possible from a server architecture perspective midway through the 2010s, not a new genre concept, a newly possible genre in execution. And then I started spending time in research labs, investing more of my personal time to understand that technology, doing a little bit of investing. And that led me to produce more content on that theme. And then I was actually underway writing the first edition of this book, which I really think is a fundamentally different edition from the second edition, before Meta even used the word in public. And then, of course, the end of 2021, they changed their name. And then 2022, it was one of the words du jour.
And it all happened incredibly fast. I remember one of the first, conversation you and I had probably was around 2020 or early 2021. And it still felt like there is incredible level of lack of understanding and underappreciation of not only where we're heading, but also the time and the length it will take to actually realize that, which leads me to talk a bit about, your view on the metaverse is sometimes viewed as aspirational or as a vision of kind of the ultimate end goal of the metaverse. Whereas today, we have platforms of various degrees of maturity, each of whom represent various aspects of your definition at various stages of the metaverse. If we had to use the old baseball analogy, what inning of the development of the metaverse do you think we're in? Which I also think is a very relevant question to ask today, because one of the first things that when I talk to people about the metaverse, about Roblox, about Fortnite, and so on and so forth, everyone is asking the question, are we there already, or is it ever going to happen? Is the metaverse a place, or is it a point of time of how we think about technology and the evolution of the internet? And so would love for you to take us through, from your own definition of the metaverse, what is already here and what are some of the things that still need to come together to bring the metaverse to life in its visionary format?
So in my book, I describe the full spec metaverse, which is to say the version that we imagine fantastically, providing all of the capabilities and integrations and interoperability and unity that one would hope that science fiction theorists and lab researchers have always envisioned. It's important to recognize that the idea of the end state of any technology is a fantasy. Mobile phones have existed for decades. Smartphones are in their 30th year. Nearly everyone has them. And yes, we talk about the increasingly minuscule advances in smartphones, but that technology is not complete, not by any means. And we're starting to see that now with artificial intelligence. What's important to recognize is that while we're on this journey, we will go through periods of time in which different things are established, right? The technological enablers are one, the commercial models are another, the standards that would enable exchange of information are a third, the actual partnerships might be a fourth. And so we have to think of all of these things differently maturing at different times. And so that's one of the reasons why that question of when is the metaverse here is a strange one. And it's a hard one. And I don't mean that to be evasive, but I'll give you my favorite example, which is Fortnite really pioneers crossplay in 2018. And at the time, there was nothing technologically precluding us from having ubiquitous crossplay and cross-platform gaming across all modern experiences. The challenge was there were not the commercial deals in place. And so we have to start to separate which of these are technological, what types of technologies, which are commercial, which are decisions. But what I want to highlight is really this question around aspiration. At a reductive level, I think we can think of the metaverse as a 3D version of the internet. And that's helpful because when we actually look at the internet, we recognize that the internet is a fundamentally interoperable network. And yet, despite that fundamental premise, the internet is not perfect. It's profound. It underpins nearly every business, country, person's day-to-day experience, but it is what many people would call aspirational 40 years ago. Why? Because it does that. And yet at the same time, think about where the internet isn't interoperable. The fact that we have a common communications protocol and stack for the 2D internet doesn't mean that there aren't paywalls on the internet. It doesn't mean that every network is online. It doesn't mean that every network is connected. It doesn't mean that you can port your data from one platform to another. It doesn't mean that I can use my X login on Facebook. And it doesn't mean that I can take my YouTube video and pump it out to every other application as I see fit. It doesn't mean that I can take my likes from Facebook and export them along with the rest of my profile to upload them onto Google Plus or whichever alternate network you have. The reality of all things interoperable, whether it's the internet or frankly, the world economy, globalization at large, is that it's never perfect. There are gaps, there are limitations, there are closed borders, there are taxes and tariffs. And so I do think that in many regards, people think that my vision is aspirational. And I like to remind them that the internet, we kind of assume has already built that for 2D, but it hasn't. And that hasn't stopped it from being remarkable. And that's what brings to that last point, which is just as it's fallacious to say that the metaverse might ever be complete, it's wrong to say that the internet is complete. In fact, you and I are fortunate to be in a specific point in time in which the interoperability and the openness of the internet, already remarkable, is expanding. That's being pioneered through business practices. We see a lot of that from Meta, and it's being pioneered by consumer wants. We may or may not see that from crypto, and we're seeing it from regulatory action in the EU in particular. And so I don't think it's aspirational. I think it's aspirational if you put a deadline on it.
And what I want to add here, and I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense from a standpoint of we can't really have a point of time where things move from theory to practice. And we also cannot be too deterministic that there is only one ultimate vision of what the metaverse is, and it's not the metaverse until that becomes, right? The evolution of the internet in and of itself is composed of multiple technologies happening at the same time, which is also quite confusing, I think, for people. But I want to switch gears and talk about for a second about the users, about the people. One of the things I like or enjoy telling people when we talk about Roblox, for example, is that there's a whole generation now that essentially has been born into quote unquote a 3D internet. When we look at Minecraft, when we look at Fortnite, when we look at Roblox, there is now a large population on the internet that experience the internet as a, let's call it kind of an avatar-based 3D environment where they are able to communicate, connect, socialize, play games in a 3D environment as an avatar, which is very unintuitive to anyone above age 25 that has been born or was raised in the era of, 2D internet, the regular internet, right? Scroll, applications on mobile phone, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's fascinating is to see that some of the human behaviors that would essentially be so intuitive or natural or organic to a 3D internet are happening in these small clusters of platforms like Roblox, for example. And so I want to ask you this question, because I know you've been looking at Roblox a lot, almost at an equal degree as you've looked at Fortnite and what Epic Game is doing. What is the importance of the existence of platforms like Roblox today and UEFN, Fortnite, as we are looking to evolve that concept of the 3D internet and educating the wider world about what it might feel like, what it might look like, what type of thing you would be able to do as a consumer, as a business, as a brand in a quote unquote 3D internet?
So fundamentally, I think it's important to recognize that actually many of the primitives of the online era are consistently pioneered by these more toyetic or childlike experiences and platforms. When you think of something like Snapchat or even message boards before that, or Facebook at large, they are typically pioneered by either the collegiate population or often the much younger population of high schoolers, sometimes on the younger side. And then eventually that behavior starts to normalize. It normalizes in one of two ways. Number one is you have the demographic expansion that reflects older generations trying to contact and communicate downwards. The fundamental reason to start that older demographics, primarily in their late 30s and 40s and 50s, adopted Facebook was to communicate with their children, often their children who were just off to college. Why? They wanted to see what their son or daughter was doing, what their lives were like, who their friends were. They wanted to communicate with them where they knew that they could reach them. Recall, this is a point in time in which many Americans didn't have smartphones and they didn't communicate through IM everywhere, and Facebook was that medium. The same thing has happened through Snapchat. Snapchat has more than 450 million DAUs. They have an excess of 800 million MAUs last I checked. The idea that a sexting app from 2011 would be that popular, doing billions of messages a day, is foreign to someone who assumes that that's the primary use case. But of course, that's what it was, but now it is just a communication means that spans multiple generations. And that connects to that second primary driver. And that second driver is the graduation in the generational age sense of those early users. It's been 14 years since Snapchat came out. It has been 25 or 20 years since Facebook came out. And so all of a sudden you have those who used to be under 18 who are now 38 going on 40. And so we see that expansion. That behavior just continues to grow out on multiple different dimensions. And so when you're asking this question as to how important or impactful or to what degree does behavior on Roblox or Fortnite presage the future, the answer is incredibly so. And to be honest with you, that's not new even in 3D gaming. Most of what is being built right now is based on 90s ideas. It's based often on 90s technology. Tim Sweeney or Dave Baszucki are 90s engineers, for example. They are bringing to fruition visions that they've long had. Roblox itself, founded in 2004, launches in 2006. It's not a new behavior. It's just a newly mainstream behavior that will continue to grow in that direction.
Do you see and I think Facebook is such an interesting case study because what's really unique with Facebook that you haven't seen with Roblox or other platforms in 3D is that Facebook primarily was catering to 16, 18 plus audience, which obviously naturally kind of evolved with that cohort because it became a utility of how you communicate, socialize, find friends, find dating, whatever, and just check out what's new with your network. Roblox primarily still is a platform for under 18, kids and youth. I like when people talk about Roblox and we're now referring to 13, 15, 16-year-old, almost like aging up the platform. But these are still young people with limited purchasing power, with a lot of restrictions from a regulation standpoint, etc. So talking about Roblox specifically, to what extent that difference that the main cohort of that platform are really still kids and teens and maybe some young adults could potentially impact the evolution of platforms like Roblox to really become a widespread utility?
Well, so it's interesting. One of the things that I find really fascinating about Roblox is the degree of its growth over the last few years is such that focusing on the percentage or the breakdown of the relative audience is almost a distraction. And by that, I mean, you're right that they have, roughly, I think they say it's now 62% over 13. But to your point, if we talk about under 16 or under 18, it's going to be the majority, if not 2/3, 70%. And yet, most external estimates suggest that there are about 350 to 370 million monthly active users. And so in comparison, Nintendo Online, I think last I checked, was about 110 to 115 million monthly active accounts. You have Xbox Live that's at about 110. You have PlayStation, which I think is around that same measure of 95 to 110. And so we're talking about an ecosystem that is essentially the same size, if not slightly larger, than the entirety of AAA gaming on console devices, for which there's some duplication with PC, don't get me wrong. At the point in time in which you're talking about 350, 375 million MAUs, you can take a huge cut out of that and attribute that to under 13. Not monetized, not particularly scalable. Certainly it's going to change when they go outside more. They have more disposable income. They have more mature taste profiles. At the same time, we're talking about a denominator for which any practical fraction is still producing a product that is enormous. Put another way, we're still talking about 100 million conservatively, up to 150 million monthly active users who are over 18. That is a sizable darned audience. And it is one that the company has not provided much information around retention, but we know enough by the overall growth of the ecosystem to believe that many of them are enduring and they're sticking around. And certainly the extent to which we then say some of those customers who are lost maybe from Roblox, yes, but retained in equivalent, thematic platforms of Minecraft or VR chat, Rec Room, Fortnite. We're talking about a pretty sizable audience here. Tim Sweeney previously estimated 600 million monthly active users inside of metaverse-style platforms. More recently, estimates suggest that we're up to 800 million. And the beautiful thing about that is we have yet to identify why that tailwind, that progression, that trend line is going to stop. I can't tell you it won't, but what I can tell you is that the burden of proof is not on that arresting. Why? Because we've had virtual simulations for 7 decades now. Every year they become more capable, more widely distributed, more diverse in what they can do. They reach more devices that are more closely at hand, and they're able to provide a more rich form of integration into your life. And until that stops, or we find something that fundamentally supplants it, or a Sophon arrives on Earth and shuts down our ability to use such technology, I don't know why it would stop.
Let me add another kind of flavor on top of that, right? Because I think one of the exciting things in my mind, and honestly what got me excited to start Super Social, is helping to create an internet that is with a virtual reality that is indistinguishable from our real world reality. And what I want to add here to the conversation is, and I think you're touching upon that in your book, so this is a great opportunity to get kind of a glimpse into how you're really bringing that component into the book, and that is, of course, AI. And so in your mind, what is really the fundamental role that you believe AI plays in really accelerating the evolution of a 3D internet and really creating potentially a virtual reality that is indistinguishable from the one we have in real world?
Sure. So there are 3 or 4 core ways in which I think we can answer this question. In the book, I detail 6, but we can reduce it a little bit for simplicity. The first is to understand that what we want to develop has technological limitations for which actual physics are the barrier. And by that, I mean, we all talk about, well, what if my Oculus or Quest device, my Vision Pro, were a sixth of the weight, twice the resolution, twice the frame rate, had 10 times the battery life, and felt 5 times more comfortable? There are serious fundamental reasons why it isn't. We talk about latency in a first-person shooter game. It's hard for me to play Fortnite against a friend of mine who's in the UK, let alone Japan. There are real limitations that we face, and AI is not a perfect balm for them. But the criticality of AI in overcoming through prediction, through smart processing, through rapid ingest and output of content actually allows us to kind of cheat physics. We're not literally cheating physics, but we're allowing systems to exist beyond how they would be able to if they were just running on the local logic, right? I'll give you an example. My favorite one is to talk about smartphones. Nearly all of our photos today are fictitious to some extent. We're not actually capturing an image per se. That's because what is required to capture an image is pretty simple. You want a sharp image, you need a larger lens or a longer exposure time. That's not practical on most smartphones. And yet smartphones are taking photos that are often DSLR great. They look spectacular. And the reason why that's possible is that our devices are using an onboard neural network that isn't just understanding when is Yon smiling, take the photo there. It's scanning the image to recognize what's in it, using that to establish focus and balance. Then it's literally processing images. The leaf that you see in the background of your image is sharp because your device has tuned it up based on what it knows a leaf to look like and what it's received in the scarce bits captured or photons captured by your device. And so that's an example of how we use AI to operate ahead of the physical reality of the devices that we want. If you want to dream of being able to do anything on your AR glasses, just not possible without artificial intelligence. The second is to realize that the barriers to creation remain extraordinary. That is true in every medium. In drawing, in music, you need thousands of hours of patience, thousands of hours of hard work. You need professional training, access to resources and tools. That's never going to go away. There's a skill barrier in all things worth doing. But we see through AI the ability to substantially reduce some of that complexity, that burden, while improving the quality of the output. Dave talks about the fact that within 5 years, he thinks entire worlds will be able to be spoken into existence. And we've seen more recently some of those demonstrations where you can describe a car, not just the visuals of a car, but its materials, its properties, its touch, its gravity, all of the components working together. By reducing the friction to creation and improving the quality of creation, while reducing the cost and the time, we will be able to populate the metaverse in a way that would never have been possible. This extends to a 2B, which is the metaverse is not just a purely virtual space. It is a complement that is often running the physical world itself. As hard as it is to produce purely virtual or synthetic fictional spaces, it's harder still to digitize the physical world into virtual space. If you want Panera or whatever, the local Man City playground to be in virtual space, it is hard. And if you want that to happen constantly, to be updated in near real time, to reflect the changes and the happenings, it's not just a question of how many developers and designers and systems and cameras do you have to develop it. It's just impossible. But you start to have AI that can rapidly, if not instantaneously, transplant that information and bring it over into the metaverse or virtual space. The third area that I would talk about is the ways in which actually populating that metaverse, which has two different aspects, is essential. The first is talking about populating with AI agents, things and people to do, experiences you can interact with that don't require another human to be on the keyboard, that really give life, joie de vivre into these experiences. I'm not saying that we're going to go to the metaverse and just talk to AI, but we need some sorts of guides and assistance. If you want to go do the magic school bus in Roblox or VR at any time, having an AI assistant or Miss Frizzle to complement a class is going to be important. Similarly, when we're talking about the sophistication of digital twins that we imagine, we're talking about virtual systems that are operating entire factories and plants, optimizing vast networks of infrastructure. There are serious constraints to how much a human can and cannot process the relevant information that will be captured in a digital twin. There are further limits to how quickly they can action that information and with which degrees of accuracy. Put more plainly, the digital twins that many envision to have their full impact not only require AI for generation of that digital twin, they require AI for operation of that digital twin to its fullest potential. And then finally, now you've tricked me and I'm going into like all of the different enumerated senses. We talk a lot about interoperability. Interoperability is brutal because it requires standardizing around a few different practices, few different code formats, and more importantly, code conventions. And that's really important, right? What do you program, why, and how? And then, of course, what metadata do you attach? Well, with AI, that's starting to go away. You want to transplant Unity code, which is XYZ, to Unreal, which is XZY. Well, AI starts to do that. Now, that's simple. We're just talking about coordinate remapping. But if I'm giving you something in Blender and it looks like a basketball and you want to put it into Maya, but the basketball doesn't have texture, right, material, and the basketball doesn't have weight, and you want to interoperate that asset or carry that asset over, but you need different physical properties, right? Perhaps, Yon, you've made a game with fantastical basketballs that bounce 3 times as high as they would in the other game. Well, historically, you either needed to program the additional data for those other use cases, or the receiving party had to manually code the relevant data or modifications to support that. With AI, that goes away. Okay, it's a basketball. Okay, what are the properties of a basketball? What's the dimensions? What's the appropriate use case? What do we know about the environment that it's being imported into? This is another one of those examples where the brutal requirements of constructing the metaverse we imagine fundamentally exceed manual capability. And yet, with AI, we start to get that away. It happens to be one of the reasons why I'm sincerely worried about the implementation of AI for game developers, because irrespective of whether or not you believe in, the lump theory of labor, there will be people who are displaced temporarily and permanently where hardships arise from how AI is implemented. But it's one of the reasons why, in aggregate, over time, I'm nevertheless hopeful that it is going to be such a boon for creation and time and spend and experience and range that it is a strong net good for these job classes.
Well, I think what's really important to keep in mind, and we've seen it likely in every technological evolution that we've seen, is that there's certainly going to be a portion of the population where jobs are displaced and jobs that are becoming basically irrelevant. But we have to remain optimistic that the innovation that will be possible given these technologies will usher a new era of other things that people can do. Now, certainly it means that there's going to be a period of time of pain where we're not going to be able to figure out those answers quickly enough to find jobs for a new generation. But I do believe, and I choose to be optimistic, that the evolution of the internet and what AI will enable will certainly create new opportunities for how people create value, essentially. Now, will that be sufficient to create a world economy or a virtual economy that people like Jensen Huang said, the virtual economy of the metaverse could be as big or even bigger than the economy we know today? We don't know what that means yet. The one thing that I want to double click on with regards to the role of AI and interoperability as well is we obviously have an internet today where a lot of the biggest platforms, most of the biggest platform are very much siloed. Roblox is a well-closed platform with very little, if at all, interoperability. Fortnite UEFN has its own architecture, of course, a bit more open. You're able to now connect many, many more creation suites, like you mentioned Blender, Maya, etc. And I know that Tim Sweeney would very much want an ecosystem that is even more open. The Apple ecosystem is still very close and dominated by iOS, so on and so forth with Android. What needs to happen and what needs to be true to really ensure that there is an open ecosystem where things are not only siloed, but are also happening to actually enable interoperability across this next-gen internet?
So first and foremost, I think it's important to emphasize that real work in construction is happening right now, and it's happening there over a few different levers. We have the Metaverse Standards Forum, which is actually not a standards body itself, but it is arranging and facilitating different collectives and forums that then shape and collaborate and commit to various standards. We have the Alliance for Open USD, or Universal Scene Description. And this is a format pioneered by Pixar, widely and commonly, very famously embraced by Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, who describes it as the HTML of the metaverse, that parties such as Apple and Unity, Unreal, IKEA, Disney have embraced as a common format. Now, that is not economic interoperability of goods or business models, but it is standardization of workflows and pipelines and asset generations that make it much easier for something that is created for a single use to be repurposed elsewhere, whether that's by a different platform or in a different experience. Those sorts of endeavors are actually really important because they start to fundamentally and almost silently drive standardization. Because each year, as the utility of a given format grows, the implied costs of continuing with a separate, conflicting, ancillary standard go up. Why? Because it's harder for you to access talent that is familiar with it. Your costs of production go up. Your utility goes up. And so my point here, Yon, is just to emphasize that though it's not apparent to consumers, and consumers mostly say, well, why can't I take product A into product B? You have to recognize that a lot of the answer is actually that the technology doesn't yet exist to do it, or the platforms don't yet support it technically, and then appreciate that they wouldn't see that happening behind the scenes, but it is happening. The second thing that I would say is that we do see actual economic efforts and frameworks beyond just the asset standardization to start to build that. The most public example is Epic. We see other examples in Meta where they are trying to build economic frameworks to do exactly that, and they are slowly branching out to support it. We see this in Epic with Rocket League and Fortnite Lego. We're likely to see it, I don't know, with Fall Guys coming to the platform. Disney is launching its own metaverse platform within Fortnite, and they've been clear that it's going to be independently operated and integrate into that Fortnite ecosystem. So we're going to start to see entitlements that are managed by Fortnite that then are managed by Disney, presumably. And that starts to seed an ecosystem that becomes increasingly lucrative, in theory, again, I don't know, for other parties to graft onto. If that's successful, if Meta is successful, then the economic pressures for new companies to not or to disconnect from those experiences change. And the primitives, the pressure for a company like Roblox or Minecraft or PUBG or whomever to stay closed change. I'm not going to say that Roblox and Fortnite are ever going to be fully open. But again, this gets to the early point is we can't think of open versus closed, because the truth of the matter is, even when we talk about closed platforms, they're not really. It's a question of what is closed and what is open. You can log into the New York Times with a Facebook account. You can log into Tinder with a Facebook account. That doesn't mean that Facebook social graphs, APIs, and content are fully open, but there is some exchange and cross-federation of data. When you play an Xbox game on PlayStation, you're using your Xbox ID on the PlayStation device. You can now connect Discord across many of the major console platforms for openness of audio comms. But of course, that is rivalrous ecosystems collaborating on a selective basis. And so the hope here is that as the metaverse continues to develop, as it is, that we will start to see economic forces and technological progression start to push more and more openness. And eventually, we start to see these cataclysmic moments happen. I mentioned earlier, cross-platform play was not technically hard in 2018. What opened it was the economic strength of Fortnite. For Sony, it was fundamentally costing them players, playtime, and spend. And that required them to open up. And that's the hope elsewhere. And I like to remind individuals that when we say cross-play, we're actually flattening multiple different aspects that are really important. It's cross-purchase, it's cross-play, and it's cross-progression, which is to say you can purchase something and it's reflected on other, often rivalrous platforms. You pay on Switch and you still can use it on Xbox. It's cross-play. These separate ecosystems are still interoperating for live service experiences. And it's cross-progression, that what you do, what you've achieved, what history you've built happens across multiple different platforms. And of course, we can break that down even further. You can talk about the idea that you have cross-communication, and that's now not just within games such as Fortnite, it's within ecosystems with Discord. This is happening. But the reason why that cross-platform is important to break down entitlements and purchases and all the rest of it is it starts to enumerate just how tricky this is here. And of course, we still have ways to go. If you buy Call of Duty on your PS5, you can't play it on Xbox, right? You're still locked within Steam. There's a lot of different ways in which we have to go. But make no mistake, the arc here is good. It just takes a long time because it's not just about the tech. It's about personalities and business models.
Yeah, and the evolution of these companies as well, which also leads me to want to switch gears and talk for a few minutes about an area that you spend quite a lot of time in your career, and that's the entertainment business. And when we think about the dramatic changes that are happening in Hollywood, the challenges of streaming services growing, we're looking at what's happening now with Skydance and Paramount, and really big changes that are happening in the entertainment industry. What does it all mean for traditional entertainment as we look into the next 5-10 years?
So I wrote this essay a few years ago. It's called "What's an Entertainment Company in 2021 and Why Does the Answer Matter?" And what I like to highlight is it has become very common for a comic book company, a video game company, a movie company, a TV company, a toy company to say we're not those things. We're actually an entertainment company. And that's a really important and healthy way to look at it. And the reason why is we have to recognize that an entertainment company, in my view, is really in the business of doing three things: telling stories, building love for those stories, and monetizing that love. Sometimes what an entertainment company does is just one or two of those things, right? I think we would say that Disney in the 1990s with its direct-to-video strategy was not really building love for their stories. No one was like, man, I love The Little Mermaid 2. My love for Ariel has grown because of The Little Mermaid 2 or Lion King 2, Lion King 3, Lion King 1.5. But it was telling a story and it was a really good way of monetizing the extant love built by The Lion King 1. I would say that many mobile games are a good example of that. You're not really telling a story per se. You're certainly not building love, but it's a good value extraction model. And of course, that's important for a business, but you can take it to extremes. My point is that over time, what role they play changes. There was a point in time in which the best place to tell a story was the movies. There was a point in time in which the best place to monetize a story was in the movies. There was a point in time in which if you wanted to build a rockstar new franchise, that's coming from the movies. But in 2024, it seems that if you want to create a new story or renew a story, that video games are often the best place to do it, right? We see that with The Last of Us or Fallout, and we'll see it in years to come. Comic books are clearly still the best place to tell and create a comic book story. You know, everything that we're still seeing in Marvel, whether it's Miss Marvel or Miles Morales, these are actually relatively recent heroes. In fact, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is not saying, let's create heroes and debut them in our films. They're saying, let's create them in the comics and then adapt them, right? It's where we'll build love for Miles Morales, and it's where we'll monetize, because the comic is telling the story and it's not really building much love or much revenue. And so when you say, what does all of this mean for Hollywood? We are seeing a very familiar transition. Barbie's another good example, right? Where the role of an individual medium changes. It's still part of an ecosystem. I know that there's controversy around, should a video game even want to be adapted to the big screen? Doesn't that change it? And look, the reality is like, that's awesome. It's building more fans, it's driving the ecosystem. It's another way of telling the story. I don't think we have to think of expansion as diminishing the achievements elsewhere. But what we are seeing is a fundamental shift on a generational basis in those anchors. When you think of entertainment, well, where's the best place to tell the story? Where's the best place to build love for the story? Where's the best place to monetize? In many instances, video games are one, but not many others, right? I don't think most people say that Hogwarts Legacy was the best Harry Potter story that they had, but it told a pretty good one, and it was commercially successful. And for people who have not touched a book in 30 years in the Harry Potter universe, it certainly renewed that love. And if another Harry Potter book comes out, maybe we'll see that it does better as a result. And so that's how I think about it here, is these changes in the roles here, none of which are fundamentally threatening. It's just how you react to it that's hard.
Matthew, we're going to pause here, and I'm going to call this part one Matthew Ball, because once we're going to digest this info and I'm going to read your book, we're going to do a part two. So I'm going to get your commitment right here for a part two. But this has been illuminating. We're at time, and I want to make sure that we're able to kind of take a lot of the information. There's so many points that you've mentioned in a really eloquent way that I think are going to help a lot of people better understand where we are and where we're heading. And I think there's just so many people. I mean, I think millions of people that are so excited about what is happening, and there's just so much confusion. The metaverse, generative AI. My favorite thing that has happened over the past several months is that, oh, metaverse is dead. Now it's AI. I'm like, how can it be dead? We haven't even started. It's all part of this mix of things that people are just getting so confused. And so I'm excited to read the next version of the book and see how you've taken your first one and evolved it with all of the things that have happened with blockchain, up and down, still TBD, what's happening with crypto and that role. the role of crypto and blockchain in the evolution of the internet. Certainly AI, I know, is a big part of the next version of the book. And so I look forward to share with our viewers this part, but then also read the book and come back and have another conversation on some other components. And I think the entertainment industry specifically is capturing a lot of minds and attention because of the upheaval, not only with what's happening to cinema and movies, but to your earlier point around workforce. Mm-hmm. AI is dramatically going to impact storytelling. And I think this is certainly an area I'd love to deep dive with you as well.
That sounds great. I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks for joining, and to be continued.
See you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the metaverse.